So the title of my paper is just plain politics. It's a paper that I'm co-authoring with Dr. Fox down in the math department. And so what we want to do, or first I should first off start off just by thanking you. It's the polite thing to do. So I want to just thank you all for having me and coming to this talk. It's always a pleasure to get to talk about research with passionate people who care about ideas and want to try to understand the world a little bit better. So at the end, there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A. I'm going to stop recording for the Q&A part, just so that's all, private or whatever. Now, as a quick disclosure, I am an economist. Okay, and so what this means is that I see the world in a very particular way. This doesn't mean a political way or anything like that, but the framework through which we kind of analyze the world is somewhat unique. I'm also a public choice economist, which basically means that I like to examine government through the lens of economics. And so what that lens is depends on four pillars. Okay, so the first is what we call methodological individualism. And the idea here is that only individual people can actually choose, not groups of people, and certainly not buildings. Okay, and so this sounds like easy enough, but I'm sure that all of us have at one point bemoaned something that like Congress did. But if we think about it, Congress, or really the Capitol, is a building, right? Congress can't do anything. Only the people inside of Congress can actually do something. Or perhaps, more relevant to our experience, perhaps we've gotten upset or frustrated at something that the administration here has done. But really, the administration is a group of people. And so what methodological individualism would demand is that we analyze the behaviors of each of those individual people and how those behaviors aggregate up into what we could call the group's decision. Okay, so the first pillar is methodological individualism. We study individual people and their behaviors. The second is what we call rational choice. Now, this one is super contentious among non-economists because they think it means something different, and I want to give the economist definition so that we're all on the same page. So what rational choice means is literally just you try your best to do the things that you're trying to do, and that's it. It doesn't mean anything about being correct. It doesn't mean anything about making wise decisions or anything like that. It literally just means that we are trying our best to do the thing that we're trying to do. So for example, when I play golf, my goal is to try to get the ball in the hole in as few strokes as possible. I want to avoid hitting the ball out of bounds. But as Dr. Wagner and Dr. Duncan can attest, I do on occasion hit the ball out of bounds. That doesn't mean that I'm irrational. It just means I'm bad at golf. Okay, I'm still fully rational because I am trying to do something and I'm trying my best to do it. The third pillar is what we call politics as exchange. What this means is not that people buy and sell politicians or anything like that. All it means is that when we cast a vote, we vote for the thing that we think is best. Okay, so it's related to the idea of rational choice. But in this context, we vote for what we think would actually be best. Sometimes that means we choose something that we think is good for ourselves. Sometimes it means we choose something that we think is good for the country. Sometimes those two things are one and the same. Sometimes they're at odds, right? But whatever it is that we decide to vote for, we think it's best by some criteria that we as individual people subjectively hold. And then the last pillar is what we call behavioral symmetry. So what this basically means is that people respond to incentives. They respond to incentives whether they are elected officials or whether they're in the grocery store. Okay, so if the benefit of doing something increases, whether that's in the political sphere or the market sphere, you're going to do more of that thing. If the cost of it increases, whether that's in the political sphere or the market sphere, you're going to do less of it. Okay, we don't assume that when people get elected, they fundamentally are transformed into some new type of being called political man or political woman. They're just people, and that's it. We assume the same set of behavioral predictions in the market as we do in politics as well. So these four pillars ultimately won a guy named Jim Buchanan the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1986. And basically his summary of his research was that politicians are people too. And that's all we really assume. So what my paper is going to do, and what we seek to do in our paper, is to understand political polarization at the federal level in the United States. It should be no secret that this is at an all-time high right now. Long-run trend has been toward increasing polarization. So this isn't a Trump exclusive phenomenon. If you're someone on the left, it's not Trump's fault that we're super polarized. If you're on the right, it's not Obama's fault either. This is a trend that we can observe in all sorts of different data sets going back to like 1987, okay? So we've seen increasing polarization for a very long time. What seems to be true, or what the latest research I've seen argues that people like President Trump and perhaps President Obama as well are more the result of polarization, not the cause of polarization, okay? Did they contribute to it? Sure, I'm perfectly fine with that assumption. In this context, for the purposes of our paper, whether they contributed to it or are a product of it, not a huge relevant thing. The fact of the world is we're super polarized, and what we want to do is try to examine why. And so what's caused this trend? Well, we argue that it's a combination of two factors. So the first one would be the increased size and scope of the federal government. So before the pandemic, government spending accounted for over 40% of all economic activity in the United States. So to put this another way, for every single thing that happened in the United States, at least in terms of commercial activity, 40% of it was either directly paid for by the government or indirectly influenced by what we could consider the government's behest. So what we're saying here is that being in a position to influence this apparatus means that you wield a tremendous amount of economic power. And then the second part here is the increased concentration of this power within the hands of very few people. So thanks to several rule changes at the federal level that have occurred over the last 50 years or so, the majority leaders in both chambers wield a tremendous amount of power over what the legislature actually ends up doing, okay? So the persons who have this power, number one would be the president. So we do see a lot of legislation through executive order, but this is not going to be the focus of this talk. I'm happy to comment on this during the Q&A session if you would like. What we are going to focus on, though, is the role of the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader for this talk. And specifically, we're going to focus on their power over committee assignments, because most people underappreciate the role of committee assignments in actually determining any sort of outcomes at the federal level. Okay, so some quick background. So this is from previous research, which is why I have 2011 data. I just haven't updated it for 2021. I'm happy to comment on that as well. Okay, so in 2011, in that congressional term, which lasted from 2010 to 2011, there were 6,677 unique bills that were introduced. I'll explain the asterisks in a quick minute here. The average length of the bill was about 60 pages each. There were 1,384 committee hearings, with each committee hearing having on average roughly 6 experts testifying, and the average testimony length. So when an expert witness testifies to a congressional committee, they submit a report. So that's their actual testimony. And then the Congress people will just ask them questions about that report, right? So this is why congressional hearings aren't typically just someone reading a report, they're answering questions. And the questions are coming from the report, okay? So each of those reports is on average about 30 pages. Now the asterisk to explain that, so when I say 6,677 unique bills, if the House passes a bill and then the Senate passes an amended version of that bill has to go back to the House, because identical versions have to pass both the House and the Senate before they reach the president's desk. I'm not counting sending the bill back to the previous chamber as a new bill. So this is 6,677 unique bills. And then the two stars here, these numbers are actually much lower compared to the historical norms. So in a typical congressional setting, there's somewhere around 10,000 unique bills introduced, and there will be something around 2,000 committee hearings happening. Okay, so for some reason, this congressional session was just a little bit lower than normal, and by actually quite a bit. Okay, so if we assume that the average person can read roughly 250 words per minute, which the average person truly reads around 200 words per minute, so we're giving Congress people an edge here in terms of their reading time. Through some quick math, we can find that the minimum amount of reading per bill on average would be somewhere around 330 pages, which means it would take our congressional leaders about 11 hours to read all of the relevant material for each bill. And if we multiply that by 6,677 unique bills, that means that every single congressional session has about 73,447 hours of reading. Now, I don't know if you know how many hours there are in a year, but the answer is 8,760. And so every 2 years or every congressional session, 8 years worth of reading gets published by Congress. This is clearly untenable. There is just no way that we could realistically expect every single member of Congress to read every single page that would be relevant for any bill that they want to vote on. Okay, so we need a solution to this. We need to somehow reduce the amount of reading that people have to do. Okay, and so what we've done is we've established committees. And this comes back from Bertrand de Juvenal in 1961. Great paper called The Chairman's Dilemma. I highly recommend reading it because it's just this wonderful piece that's just absolutely hysterical, but also really important. And what he argues is that the whole, when what he means by the whole, he means the entire legislature, reading everything is completely untenable. And even just discussing everything as a whole would be untenable, okay? And so what you do is you break the whole into smaller groups and give them jurisdiction over certain areas of legislation. Okay, so the Agricultural Committee, for example, would have primary legislative jurisdiction over bills pertaining to agriculture, okay? And what this does is it reduces everyone's time needed to read, but also allows for specialization within legislative areas. So like Debbie Stabenow, the US Senator from Michigan, has been on the Agriculture Committee for something like 25 years. She has worked really hard and has developed a lot of institutional knowledge and relevant policy knowledge about agriculture and what works from an agricultural policy perspective. That's great. So at some level, the committee system is a win-win-win. It's a win for the American people in the sense that the people in Congress writing and discussing the bills are actually knowledgeable about that area due to their specialization. It's a win for the Congress people because they have to read fewer bills since they have jurisdiction over a smaller number of bills. And it's a win for the institution itself in the sense that everyone in America benefits from increased wisdom that people have. Okay? The problem, however, is we need to assign committee seats somehow. And the question of who gets to be on what committee is a fundamentally very important question. Ideally, it shouldn't matter at all. We should have every committee being a representative sample of the whole, such that the opinion of the committee is the same, is unbiased from the perspective of the whole. It's just comprised of a smaller number of people. But the reality is that it does. The committee assignments actually do matter. And the question we want to ask, or that I want to provide an answer to, is why? Okay, so let's just kind of do a quick thought experiment on how voting is typically modeled in economics and a lot of times in political science as well. We use what's called the median voter theorem. And the idea here is that the preferences of people can be ranked sort of on like a, if you want to think of it as a left-right scale, that's perfectly fine. What tends to win is the person who holds the position that is in the middle of the distribution, or at least the one that's in the median of the distribution. So this is why, for example, in primary season, we see sort of the median member of each committee, or I'm sorry, of each party kind of winning out. So the moderate Republican within the Republican sphere typically gets the nomination. There are exceptions, obviously. The moderate Democrat tends to win there. But then once they've gotten the party's nomination, we see them kind of moving toward the median of the population, okay? And so this is kind of a standard theory about how political preferences work and how winning elections actually ends up happening. You want to appeal to the broadest number of people, okay? So this is a median voter theorem model in one issue space. We can get more complicated and do it in two issue space. Okay, so here I've got three people. I've just named them A, B, and C because I'm boring. And we have two policy issues, X and Y. You can think of these policy issues as any policy issues you want. Doesn't matter what they are. Each person has different preferences along these two dimensions. Okay, so just like we all have different preferences for example, how high taxes could be or should be rather, and how strict gun control laws might be or should be, right? So too does everyone. Everyone differs in these in some way. And so what I've done is I've just modeled each person's most preferred combination of these two policies as these black dots. So person A prefers the black dot right there. That would be the perfect combination of policies from their perspective. What this does, the black triangle, would be like the feasible possibility space. Okay, some people know this as the Overton window, the idea that sometimes certain policy moves are possible and other times they're just not. They're very much related. Okay, so the feasible possibility space or the feasible policy space would be the area inside of the triangle. And then what policy would emerge from this three-person group, assuming a simple majority rule wins, would depend on whether or not the vote on X and Y is done sequentially, which means we vote on X and then we vote on Y, or if it's done simultaneously, which means we vote on X and Y as one bill. If we vote on them sequentially, then policy point S becomes the winning possibility. It is the median on the x-axis and it's the median on the y-axis. If we vote on them simultaneously, then what wins depends on which two people decide to vote together. So if persons A and B decide that they want to vote together and get whatever policy they want, the policy will be somewhere on the line between A and B. If persons B and C are best friends and they want to vote together, then the winning policy will be somewhere on BC. And if persons A and C decide to vote together, it'll be somewhere on AC. So we can already see how, depending on the rules that we decide to vote on things, that's going to influence the outcome, right? Every different point is a different policy combination. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to suppose that the whole is made up of 4 people, and I'm going to pick 3 people to be on the committee. So 3 people get to vote on what goes before the whole for final approval. And again, it's simple majority. So here I've got 2 different possible committee assignments. This would be made up of persons A, B, and C in committee 1, and persons B, C, and D in committee 2. If the votes are done sequentially, so one at a time, we can already see that S1, if we had the first committee with A, B, and C, that would be the winning outcome. And if we had if we had committee 2 with B, C, and D, that would lead to S2 as the policy outcome. So here, just changing one person on the committee, because remember, B and C are on the committee no matter what. The question is whether or not A will be on the committee or D will be on the committee. If the vote is done sequentially, the policy outcome is very different just from changing one person on the committee. If the vote is done simultaneously, the only possibility for the committee assignments to be irrelevant is if B and C are friends and agree to vote together no matter what. That's the only way that the committee assignment is completely benign or impotent toward influencing the outcome. So it's a very limited number of cases where that's actually possible. So what I wanted to do is look at how the US House Republicans actually make their committee assignments. Now I picked the US House Republicans not for any particular group, like they're not special in any way, but given my previous work background, so prior to coming to Aquinas in my younger years, I worked for the Joint Economic Committee in the US House. So the Joint Economic Committee is a committee made up of representatives and senators from both the Democrats and the Republicans. And so when I got my job with the committee, they assigned me to the House Republicans. And so I just became really familiar with how the House Republican rules worked. So the only reason I'm focusing on the House Republicans here is because I didn't have to do as much research to get the answers to these questions. I just knew it from previous experience. Okay, so each party and Chamber of Congress has its own rules for establishing how committee assignments are going to work. For the US House Republicans, there is a committee called the Steering Committee. This committee has 30 to 35 members, varying depending on the year. The Speaker of the House, or whoever the highest ranking Republican officer is, gets 4, sometimes 5 votes. The Republican leader gets 2. I should also point out that the Speaker gets to appoint 2 other members who each get 2 votes themselves to this committee by themselves unilaterally. So typically we expect that people will appoint other people who will vote in a similar way as they will. And a quorum is reached when half of the total number of votes of the committee is present, not when half of the total number of committee members are present. So you can have a quorum of the steering committee with the speaker, his 2 appointees, and the Republican leader, and I think like 3 other people. Okay, and that would constitute a quorum. A quorum means that you are allowed to make decisions on behalf of the party, or I'm sorry, on behalf of the committee, and then it's a simple majority. So if you have the minimum number of people necessary to make a decision and the speaker gets 4 to 5 votes, it's almost certainly the case that the speaker is going to get exactly what they want, okay? Within this, I should also point that different committees in the US House are ranked differently. So there are what are called A committees, there are B committees, and there are C committees. The steering committee, to go back, the steering committee only selects membership for the A committees. In the case of the B and C committees, the Speaker of the House has unilateral authority to appoint people to those. There are no necessary votes at all. Like the Speaker just says, you are on this committee, and that's kind of the end of it, okay? So in order for committee assignments to be a relevant choice criteria for the speakers, you need to be able to reward your friends and punish your enemies. Now, what this means is that you need to be able to reward the members of your committee who vote the way you want and punish the members of your party who vote against what you want, okay? So committee assignments, these are typically viewed as a reward. This is, there's lots of papers about this, but Coker and Crane's 1994 paper is kind of the big one, and they model or they assert or find evidence that committees actually act as what we could call a loyalty filter. So the more loyal or the more fidelity you show to the party leadership, the more prestigious committee assignments you will end up getting. So that would be one way to reward your friends, but how can you punish your enemies? Okay, so 2 ways to do that. One would be simply to deny them promotion to the more prestigious committees. That's certainly an option. Alternatively, we can actually see party leadership removing people from committee assignments. So in 2012, Justin Amash was removed from the Budget Committee. Tim Huelskamp was removed from the Budget and Agricultural Committees, and Quayle and Jones were both removed from the Financial Services Committee. And the question you might ask is why? Okay, and so I pulled this quote from a wonderful person from the newspaper, and he said with this being removing these 4 members from their committee assignments, had nothing to do with their conservative ideology, but had to do with their voting patterns. This, of course, came from none other than John Boehner, who was then the Speaker of the House and was in a position to influence the committee assignments quite a bit. Now, I'm going to show a really complicated graph, and I'm going to try to walk you through it a little bit here. So what I've done, I haven't drawn some sort of a demonic symbol or a pentagram or anything like that, though I will confess, when I had it on my whiteboard here, it definitely looked like it, and some people got really nervous that I was coming in and performing satanic rituals or something. So what I've drawn here is a 6-person legislature and 2 possible 5-person committees. Hey, now just for some context, a 3-person committee is pretty easy to model. 5-person is really complex. If you go beyond 5, the math is just a nightmare, which is why I brought Dr. Fox in, because he can handle that stuff, and I know it, but he's just better at it than me. So with a 5-person committee, so what I've done is I've made 5 different 5-people committees. One of them would be A, B, C, D, and E, and the other would be B, C, D, E, and F. So the only difference is whether or not A or F is on the committee. In a world where party members are free to vote with whoever they want and they're free to vote however they want, the winning position for a majority rule, if it were A, B, C, D, and E, would be the gold and green areas, okay? And if person F were on the committee instead of A, it would be the black and gold areas. So already we can see a slight difference in the feasible possibility space for what would win at the committee level. But what I argue in this paper is that because of the incentive structure of rewarding friends and punishing enemies through committee assignments, if persons A, B, and C are, let's say, Republicans, and person D, E, and F are, let's say, Democrats, then the actual feasible policy space moves away from the green and gold area to the red triangle, okay? And so there, because persons A, B, and C will vote together because they're all in the same party, that becomes the majority rule set. And then we just argue about where in that triangle it will be. If we change, if the leadership or the majority party in Congress changes such that now the Democrats have the majority, then person A gets replaced by person F on the committee. And now, because the House Democrats have a similar, though somewhat different in minute details, structure for how their committee assignments are dealt, the triangle, the blue triangle here, becomes the relevant policy space. And so what ends up happening is what ends up mattering, or what I should say, the implications of this, is who is on the committee matters, but what really matters, given the committee selection process, is which party is in the majority. Because again, that's going to change the relevant space for what policies actually could come out of committee, and therefore what policy proposals could actually reach the floor of the House or the Senate. Okay? And so then finally, members are going to be less likely to vote across the aisle for fear of not getting better committee assignments. And we do have empirical research that would suggest that better committee assignments lead to more likely re-election prospects. So being on a good committee actually is important for the individual members. So the result of this is that we become a nation divided. With 40% of GDP being determined at the federal level, what party is in control matters a lot, and not just a little bit in terms of small, minute changes. It actually completely changes what comes out of Congress. What Joe and I are working on is, thanks to campaign finance rules, the leadership gets a much larger say in who actually receives campaign funds. Again, we see a tendency for people to reward their friends and punish their enemies. And as a result of this, rather than seeing a wide dispersion of these points around in the policy space, what you end up seeing is clustering of the elected officials' policy points being closer and closer to the leaders' preferences. And ironically, what this ends up doing for the American people is it hollows out the middle voters and pushes us into the extremes. So where I said before that something like this characterized the American people, where most people were basically moderates with slight leanings to the right or slight leanings to the left, and very few people occupied the far right or the far left positions. What we're seeing today instead, thanks to the idea that what policy comes out really does depend on who has the majority in Congress. And again, even a one-person majority is a majority. What we see in the American people is what we can call a bimodal distribution rather than a single peak distribution, where if you lean slightly to the right, your options are basically the far right position, which is closer to you than the far left position. And so if you do vote and you lean slightly to the right, you are more likely to vote further right than you would for something in the middle, because something in the middle won't be presented. Alternatively, you being the moderate person in the middle, just don't vote at all. But that means that only the extreme partisan people are actually voting. And so the effect is really just the same. What we end up with is a nation divided. And while this is certainly the result of many factors, I want to argue that a underexplored factor is the role of the committee assignment process in Congress. With that, I just want to say thank you all for your attention. It's really just a treat to get to talk to you all about these ideas, and I want to open it up for Q&A as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the sharing and I'm going to stop the recording.